My name is Daniel, and like many of you, I have spent my life trying to follow God. But my journey has been marked by doubt, doubt in myself, doubt in my place in His plan, and, at times, doubt in His presence. I was raised in a family of believers, taught the scriptures from childhood, yet something always felt incomplete. There were whispers of old traditions, stories my grandmother told in hushed tones, of a covenant long forgotten, of a promise made to our people that had been buried beneath generations of misunderstanding. I never gave it much thought. Faith was about accepting, not questioning, or so I believed. For years, I struggled to reconcile my love for God with the world around me. I saw the hypocrisy of men who spoke His name but twisted His words for their own gain. I saw my community suffer, left behind by a world that seemed to forget us. I questioned why, if we were truly chosen, our prayers seemed to go unanswered. My heart ached for understanding, but I buried it beneath routine worship, hoping that obedience alone would be enough. But something inside me always yearned for more. I began to have dreams, strange, vivid visions that left me breathless upon waking. In them I stood on the edge of a great chasm, fire on one side, light on the other. A voice called my name, distant yet familiar, warning me of a time to come, of something I needed to see. I dismissed them as nothing more than dreams, my mind playing tricks on me, until the night everything changed. I remember the evening well. A cold wind swept through the streets, unusual for the season. I had just left my father's house, the weight of a long conversation pressing heavy on my chest. We had argued about faith, about tradition, about the world shifting in ways he refused to see. He clung to what had been passed down, unwilling to believe that God might reveal something new. I left in frustration, the ache of our divide lingering as I walked home. Then the crash, a blinding light, the sound of metal twisting, glass shattering, a force so sudden, so violent that I had no time to react. One moment I was crossing the street, the next I was weightless, the world spinning away from me. There was no pain, only a sensation of being pulled, lifted beyond the wreckage, beyond the sirens wailing in the distance. Then silence. I opened my eyes to a sky unlike any I had ever seen. It was not the black of night nor the blue of day, but something in between, an endless expanse of shimmering gold stretching in all directions. Beneath me was not earth, but light itself, soft yet solid beneath my feet. The air hummed with a presence, a warmth that seeped into my very soul. Every breath I took filled me with peace, as if every burden I had ever carried had been lifted in an instant. Then I saw Him. At first He was distant, a figure of light walking toward me. With each step, recognition bloomed in my chest, a knowing beyond words. My knees weakened, my heart pounded. When He reached me, I could not speak. His eyes, oh, His eyes, were unlike anything I had ever seen. They held the universe within them, sorrow and love interwoven in an infinite depth. He spoke my name, and at that moment I knew. I was standing before the Son of God. "Daniel," He said, His voice a whisper and a storm all at once. "You were meant to see this." Tears burned my eyes as I fell before Him. "Lord," I choked, my voice trembling, I don't understand. Am I dead?" He reached out, lifting me with the gentlest touch. "No," He said, "not yet, but I have brought you here because you must know what is coming. You must see what has been hidden." Before I could ask what He meant, the world around us shifted. The golden sky darkened, swirling like a storm unraveling before my eyes. Images flashed, cities crumbling, people crying out, shadows stretching over the land. I saw nations rise against each other, chaos swallowing the world in ways I could barely comprehend. Fires burned in streets I recognized, places I had walked before. The air was thick with anguish, the weight of despair pressing against my chest. Then another vision, a people, a remnant, standing in defiance of the darkness. They were clothed in white, their voices raised in a song that shook the heavens. Their faces were familiar, echoes of my ancestors, of those who had come before me. I saw the symbol my grandmother once traced upon my palm as a child, a mark I had never understood. It shone upon their foreheads, a sign of something ancient, something holy. Jesus turned to me, his gaze heavy with sorrow. "The world is approaching a time of reckoning," he said, "but there is hope. A calling placed upon your people, long forgotten, must be restored." I shook my head, my thoughts a storm of confusion. "My people," I whispered. "What do you mean?" He lifted his hand, and a scroll appeared before me, its letters glowing with an ethereal light. I recognized the language, though I had never been taught it. The words burned into my mind, a prophecy hidden in plain sight, overlooked and misunderstood for generations. "You are part of a covenant unbroken," he said, "a purpose buried beneath centuries of misinterpretation. Your people were called for more than survival. They were chosen to stand in the final days, to bear witness to my truth when the world falls into deception." A chill ran through me as I stared at the scroll, my heart pounding. "But why me?" I asked. "I'm no prophet, I'm just a man." His expression softened, sorrow shifting into something deeper. "Because you have searched," he said. "Because your heart has longed for the truth, even when you did not understand what you were seeking. And because time is short." The storm around us began to recede, the golden light returning, though the weight of what I had seen remained heavy in my chest. My mind reeled. The world as I knew it was teetering on the edge of something vast, something inevitable, and I was being called to stand in the midst of it. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. "What must I do?" Jesus reached forward, pressing his hand to my chest. A warmth unlike anything I had ever known flooded through me, filling every corner of my being. "Go back," he said. "Speak. Tell them what you have seen. Restore what has been lost, and above all, do not be afraid." The light grew impossibly bright, enveloping me in its radiance. My body felt weightless, the world around me dissolving once more. His final words echoed in my mind as everything faded into darkness. Then I woke up. I gasped for air as my eyes flew open, my chest rising and falling in erratic waves. The sterile glow of hospital lights burned into my retinas, and for a brief moment I couldn't move. Everything felt heavy, my limbs, my breath, my thoughts. Beeping monitors pulsed in rhythmic patterns beside me. Voices murmured somewhere beyond my vision, but none of it felt real. None of it could compare to what I had just seen. My mind raced to catch up, struggling to grasp the impossible. Was it a dream? A hallucination born from trauma? But no, I knew it had been real. I had stood before him. I had felt his presence. I had seen the future unravel before my very eyes. My hands trembled as I clenched the hospital sheets, my heart pounding in time with the memories crashing over me. Then the door opened. "Daniel." My father's voice. I turned my head sluggishly, my vision still adjusting. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed, the weight of sleepless nights pressing into the creases of his skin. My mother stood behind him, her hand clutched over her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. The relief in their faces told me everything. I had been gone longer than I realized. "You're awake," my father breathed, stepping closer. His voice cracked, something I had rarely heard from him. We thought we lost you." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice barely more than a whisper. How long?" My mother rushed to my side, smoothing my hair as though I were still a child. 3 days, she said softly. "You've been in a coma for 3 days. 3 days." My mind reeled. The time I had spent in that realm, was it 3 days here as well? The weight of it pressed against me, suffocating. I wanted to tell them what I had seen, what had been revealed to me, but the words caught in my throat. How could I even begin? Instead, I asked the only thing I could. "The accident, what happened?" My father let out a long, ragged breath, shaking his head. You were hit by a car crossing the street. The driver, he never even saw you. They said it was a miracle you survived at all." His jaw clenched. "Your heart stopped, Daniel, twice. The doctors, they didn't think you'd wake up." My heart stopped, twice. My mind flickered back to the moment I had felt weightless, pulled from my body, lifted into that golden expanse. Had I died? Had he sent me back? I swallowed hard, my throat raw and aching. "I saw him," I whispered. Silence fell over the room. My father stiffened. My mother's grip on my hand tightened. "I saw Jesus," I said again, firmer this time. "I spoke with him. He showed me things. He told me," my voice faltered, the enormity of it crashing over me like a tidal wave. "He told me what's coming." My father's expression darkened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Daniel," he said slowly, his tone warning, "you've been through something traumatic. Your mind—" "No." My voice came stronger now, pushing through the hoarseness, the doubt. "This wasn't a dream, it wasn't a hallucination. It was real, I was there. He showed me what's going to happen in 2030. The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker. My mother's face was pale, her lips trembling. My father's brows knit together, suspicion flickering in his gaze. He had always believed, but in the way a man believes in distant storms, acknowledging their existence but never expecting them to reach his doorstep. But I knew, it was here now, and I had been chosen to warn them. "Son," my father said, his voice laced with unease, "you need to rest. We'll talk about this later." "No," I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "You don't understand, we don't have time." He showed me. There will be war, deception, nations turning against each other, but worse than that, a great falling away. The world will be on the brink of something we can't stop, but there's still hope. There's still a chance for our people to return to him. My father's face hardened, the deep lines in his forehead deepening. "Our people," he echoed. "What are you talking about?" I licked my lips, forcing myself to breathe. This was it, the moment I had to say what had been revealed to me, even if it meant my own family would turn against me. "There's something we've forgotten," I said slowly. "Something buried under centuries of misunderstanding. Jesus told me our people were part of something greater than we ever knew. We were meant to stand in the final days to restore what was lost, but we walked away. We let the world rewrite the truth, and now the time is coming when we will have to choose." My father stepped back, shaking his head. "Daniel, you're not making sense. You have to listen to me." I pushed myself up in bed, ignoring the way my body ached with the effort. "There's a prophecy, one that was hidden, ignored, maybe even erased, but it's real. And we have to prepare, we have to warn others before it's too late." My mother let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with both hands. My father turned away, running a hand down his face, his entire frame trembling with tension. I knew what they were thinking, that I was still lost in fevered dreams, that the trauma had broken something in me. But I wasn't confused, I had never seen more clearly. "Please," I begged, my voice raw with desperation. "I don't care if you don't believe me, I just need you to hear me. 2030 will be a year of reckoning. I don't know exactly what form it will take, but it will be the beginning of something we can't ignore. And the only way to survive it is to return to him, to restore what we lost." My father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Enough, Daniel." His voice was firm now, no longer gentle, no longer filled with worry, just exasperation. "You just woke up from a coma, you need to rest. We'll talk later." He turned toward the door as if that was the end of it, but I knew I couldn't let this go. I looked at my mother, searching her face, her tear-streaked cheeks. For a moment I thought I saw something there, a flicker of understanding, of fear, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. The weight in my chest grew heavier. I had been sent back with a message, and they wouldn't listen. Not yet. But I wasn't going to stop. The days after I woke up felt like walking through a world that no longer fit me. Everything was the same, my house, my neighborhood, even the air I breathed. But I was different. I had been touched by something greater, something that had peeled away the veil of my old life, and now nothing could make me unsee what I had seen. Yet, no one believed me. My father treated me with careful patience, the kind reserved for a son recovering from trauma. My mother tiptoed around the subject, forcing strained smiles whenever I mentioned my vision. Friends visited with concerned glances, their words laced with unspoken disbelief. To them, I was still healing. To me, I was waking up while everyone else was still asleep. I tried to push through their skepticism to explain what had been revealed to me, but every time I was met with resistance. "Daniel," my father sighed one evening sitting across from me at the kitchen table, "you were in a coma. You nearly died." The brain does strange things when it's under that kind of stress. I clenched my fists, the frustration simmering just beneath my skin. You think I imagined Jesus standing before me? That I made up the visions of war, of deception, of what's coming in 2030? His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight. "I think you believe what you saw," he said carefully, "but that doesn't mean it's real." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him, to make him see what I saw, to force him to understand, but I knew it wouldn't work. He had spent his whole life believing one version of faith, the one passed down from his father and his father before him. To suggest that there was more, that something had been lost, that our people had forgotten their place in God's plan, was too much for him to accept. So I stopped trying. Instead, I prayed. For the first time in my life, I prayed with desperation, with urgency. "Lord, if they won't listen, show me another way." And he did. The first sign came a week after I left the hospital. I was walking through the city, my steps aimless, my mind a storm of unanswered questions. It was a warm afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the skyline, and the streets were alive with voices, laughter, the hum of a world carrying on as if nothing was coming, as if time itself wasn't rushing toward the edge of something unseen. Then I saw him. An old man, sitting alone on a bench near the river, his hands folded over a walking cane. He wore a simple linen robe, his silver hair swept back in soft waves. Something about him made me pause, made the noise of the city fade into the background. His eyes met mine. "Sit," he said, his voice steady, knowing. I obeyed before I could question why. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at me, his gaze calm yet piercing, as if he could see the turmoil writhing beneath my skin. "You have seen," he finally said. My breath caught. He nodded as if he already knew my thoughts. "You have been shown what many refuse to see, and now you carry a message they are not ready to hear." My mouth was dry. "How do you?" "Because it has been foretold," he said. "The ones who will rise in the final days, the ones who will remember." A chill ran through me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, his lips curled in the faintest smile. "A seeker like you." He turned his gaze toward the water, his expression distant. "Do you know why they do not listen?" I swallowed hard. "Because they're afraid." He nodded. "And because they have forgotten. They have spent generations believing they were just another people in the world, just another part of the story. They do not realize they are the story." My hands trembled as I clenched them in my lap. "Then how do I wake them up?" He exhaled slowly, as if the weight of my question was one he had carried for a long time. "You begin with those who are already stirring." I furrowed my brow. "What does that mean?" He turned to me again, his gaze sharp. "There are others. Others who have seen the signs, who have felt the pull but do not yet understand it. Seek them, speak to them. The ones who are ready will hear you." The weight of his words settled deep into my bones. "Where do I find them?" I asked. He smiled again, that knowing, almost amused expression. "You will not need to, they will find you." Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stood. I blinked, startled by the ease with which he moved despite his age. He rested a hand on my shoulder, his touch light yet firm. "Be ready, Daniel," he said. "The time is closer than you think." And then he walked away, disappearing into the moving bodies of the city, leaving me alone with a heart full of fire and a mind spinning with newfound purpose. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my skull. "They will find you." I didn't know how or when or who. But I believed him, and I knew this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, they came to me. It started with Elijah, but it didn't end with him. One by one, they appeared, people who had felt the pull without knowing why, who had sensed the shifting without being able to name it. Some had dreamed of things they didn't understand, symbols they couldn't decipher. Others had simply woken up one day with an ache in their spirit, a conviction that something was coming, something big. At first, I was cautious. I knew what I had seen, what Jesus had shown me, but I still wrestled with doubt. Why me? What if I had misunderstood? What if I was leading people into something I couldn't fully grasp myself? But the more I listened, the more I knew this was no coincidence. A woman named Miriam told me about the dream that had haunted her for years. A great wall crumbling, revealing an ancient door beneath it, a door she was too afraid to open. A man named David shared a vision he had seen while praying, an army dressed in light, standing against a darkness that spread like a flood, their faces marked with something he couldn't recognize. An elder from a neighboring town spoke of an unease he couldn't shake, a sense that prophecies long ignored were waking up. They had all been waiting for someone to confirm what they already knew in their spirits. They had been waiting for me, and that terrified me. I had spent my life searching for truth, but I never wanted to be a leader. I never saw myself as someone who would gather people, who would prepare them for a time no one else saw coming. But Jesus had chosen me, and there was no turning back. We began meeting in secret, not out of fear, but because we knew the moment we started speaking openly, we would face opposition. Not from the world, but from our own people. Because the hardest battles are never against outsiders. They are always against those who should have been fighting beside you. The first time I stood before them, my hands trembled. We had gathered in Elijah's home, his small living room packed with more people than I had expected. Some sat on the floor, others leaned against the walls, but every single one of them had the same look in their eyes. Hunger. Not for power, not for answers that would ease their fears, but for truth, for purpose. I took a breath. This was it. "You all know why you're here," I said, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "You've felt it. You've seen glimpses of it, and I'm here to tell you it's real." A few nodded. Others remained still, waiting. I swallowed hard. I died, and when I did, I stood before Jesus. Silence. I told them everything. The accident, the golden expanse, the vision of 2030, the warning of deception, of war, of nations rising and falling, the great falling away that would claim so many. But more than that, I told them about us, about what had been hidden, about who we really were. The weight of my words pressed into the room like a tangible force. I saw it in their faces, the shock, the wonder, the fear. "Why us?" someone finally whispered. I exhaled. "Because we were always meant to stand. We were always meant to remember, but we forgot. The world rewrote the truth and we accepted it. But now we have a choice, to reclaim what was lost, or to keep living as if none of this is real." I looked at each of them one by one. "I won't force you to believe me. You can walk away right now. But if you stay, you need to understand this will cost us." A long silence stretched between us. Then Elijah stood. "I'm in." Miriam stood next. Then David. One by one they chose. And in that moment I knew the remnant was waking up, and this was just the beginning. Word spread faster than I expected. We didn't announce ourselves. We didn't preach from pulpits or shout in the streets. But somehow they still found us. Some came quietly, pulling me aside after church, their voices hushed with a mix of fear and hope. Others showed up unannounced, knocking on my door in the dead of night, their faces pale, their hands shaking. "I had a dream," one woman whispered. "A voice told me to find you." I was reading scripture, a man said, his Bible clutched tightly in his hands. And suddenly, I saw something I had never seen before, a prophecy that makes sense now, but I don't know what to do with it. Over and over, I heard the same thing: something is coming, and we were being called to prepare. But with the growth came resistance. The first warning came from my father. He cornered me after a service one Sunday, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. "You need to stop this, Daniel," he said. I met his gaze, refusing to shrink under his disapproval. "Stop what?" His jaw tightened. "This group, these meetings. People are talking." "Good," I said. "Maybe they should start listening." His eyes darkened. "Do you think you're a prophet now?" I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "I think Jesus showed me something, and I don't have a choice but to share it." He shook his head. "You're leading people into dangerous thinking. Do you know how many have come to me asking what's wrong with you? They say you've changed, that you're filling people's heads with fear and conspiracy." I swallowed hard. "And what do you tell them?" "That you're confused," he said. "That you're still recovering from the accident, that you don't realize what you're doing." Pain shot through me, but I pushed it down. "And do you believe that?" His silence told me everything. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. "I just don't want to see you throw your life away for something that isn't real." I stared at him, my heart aching. "Dad," I said softly, "it's real. I wish you could see that." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Even if it were," he said, his voice quieter now, "you don't think God would choose someone else, someone greater, someone with real authority?" I let his words sink in. This wasn't just about him not believing me. This was about him not believing God would choose me. And for a moment, I felt the old doubts creeping in, the weight of every insecurity I had ever carried pressing down on me. But then I heard his voice. Not my father's, not my own, his. "Because you have searched." I straightened, the fire reigniting in my chest. "He chose me," I said, my voice steady. "I don't know why. I don't know if I'm worthy of it, but I know what I saw, and I know I can't ignore it." For a second, I thought I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, of hesitation. But then he turned away. "I won't stop you," he said. "But don't expect me to stand beside you either." And just like that, he walked away. That was the first fracture, but it wouldn't be the last. A week later, the rumors started. Leaders in the church whispered that we were straying into dangerous teachings, that we were chasing false revelations. Some even suggested that what I had seen wasn't from God at all, that I had been deceived. Then came the warnings. Doors that had always been open to me were suddenly closed. Invitations were rescinded. Friends who had once stood beside me now avoided my gaze. I was becoming an outsider. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. But I also knew something else. If they were trying this hard to silence us, it meant we were getting close to the truth. And no matter what it cost me, I wasn't going to stop. The night the first real threat came, I knew we had crossed a line. We had been meeting in Elijah's home, gathered in quiet circles, poring over scripture with new eyes, praying for clarity. Each time we met, the weight of what we were discovering grew heavier. We were no longer just searching, we were finding prophecies that had been dismissed, finding connections buried beneath centuries of misinterpretation, finding evidence that we, the forgotten ones, the overlooked ones, had a place in the final chapter of this world's story. And that terrified those who wanted things to stay the same. That night, we had just finished reading from Ezekiel when a knock rattled the door. Elijah shot me a glance. We hadn't been expecting anyone. He moved to answer, but before he could reach the handle, a voice rang out from the other side. "We know you're in there." Every muscle in my body tensed. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way they were spoken, cold, steady, devoid of anything remotely human. Elijah hesitated. "Who is it?" Silence. Then another knock, this one harder. "We need to talk, Daniel." The air in the room shifted and I felt it, a pressure, an unseen force curling around the space, wrapping around my ribs like invisible chains. Whoever was out there, they weren't here to listen. Elijah's wife, Miriam, grabbed my arm. Daniel, don't, but I was already moving. Something inside me knew I had to face this. I reached the door, my pulse hammering against my skull, and slowly pulled it open. Two men stood on the porch. I recognized them instantly. They were leaders from the church, men I had once respected. Men who had taught me as a child, who had guided my father, my grandfather before him. Their faces were calm, unreadable, but their eyes were something else. Empty, lifeless, like they were staring through me, not at me. One of them, an elder named Thomas, smiled. "We've been hearing interesting things, Daniel." I didn't speak. His smile didn't fade. "Mind if we come in?" I glanced behind me. Everyone in the house was watching, frozen in place. I turned back to them. "We can talk here." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Very well," he said. Then, after a pause, "Do you know why we're here?" I swallowed hard. "Because you're afraid." That made the other man, Elder Jacob, flinch. Thomas, however, only sighed. "No, Daniel, we're concerned. You've been leading people astray." A slow burn crept up my spine. "I've been leading people to the truth." Jacob shook his head. "Truth," he exhaled sharply. "What you're doing is dangerous. You're stirring up doubt. You're questioning things that have already been settled." "Settled by who?" I countered. "By men or by God?" A long silence. Then Thomas took a step forward. "You need to stop," he said, his voice dropping lower. "For your sake and for theirs." A warning. A threat. I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I can't." Something flickered in his eyes just for a moment. Something dark. Then he smiled again, that same hollow expression. "I hope for your sake you reconsider." Without another word, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I closed the door, locking it behind me, and that's when I realized this was bigger than I thought. Because they weren't just angry, they were afraid. And if they were afraid, it meant we were getting close to something they didn't want us to find. The next morning, I woke to find my phone flooded with messages, some from those in our group, shaken by the visit from the elders. Others from people I hadn't spoken to in years. And then there was the one from my father. "We need to talk, now." I sat up, my chest tight with unease. I knew what was coming. Last night's confrontation wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. By the time I arrived at his house, he was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed, expression grim. "You've gone too far, Daniel," he said before I even made it up the steps. I stopped short, my breath slow and steady. "You heard," he scoffed. "Of course I heard. Do you think people wouldn't talk? Do you think this wouldn't reach me?" I swallowed, the anger rising in my throat. "And what exactly did they tell you?" He stepped closer, his voice a low hiss. "That you're leading people into heresy. That you're planting seeds of rebellion in the church, twisting scripture, convincing people of some secret prophecy that doesn't exist." I clenched my fists. "That's a lie." "Is it?" His eyes burned with something between frustration and fear. "Then tell me, Daniel. Are you or are you not gathering people in secret? Are you or are you not claiming that Jesus himself spoke to you and revealed some hidden truth about our people?" I met his gaze head on. "I'm telling them what he showed me, that something is coming. That we have a place in it and we need to wake up before it's too late." He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You sound like a lunatic." A sharp pang shot through me, but I ignored it. "You were always headstrong," he continued. "Always questioning, always pushing boundaries. But this..." He shook his head. "This is dangerous." I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. "Dangerous for who?" For a moment he said nothing. Then, softer now, almost pleading, "Daniel, you don't understand what you're doing." I stepped forward. "No, you don't understand what's happening. Do you think it's a coincidence that so many people who have never met before, people from different backgrounds, different places, are all feeling the same thing, that we're all being drawn to scriptures we were never taught to read in this way, that we're having dreams, visions, warnings. He clenched his jaw. People convince themselves of all kinds of things when they're looking for meaning, I exhaled sharply. And what if this time it's real? His eyes flickered with something, hesitation maybe, doubt, but he masked it quickly. You're risking everything, he said. Your reputation, your place in the church, your future. I stared at him. What good is a reputation if it keeps me from telling the truth? What good is a place in the church if I have to deny what God has shown me? What future is there if we ignore the warnings and let deception take hold? His mouth pressed into a thin line. And what if you're wrong? The question hung in the air between us. I took a breath. And what if I'm right? He looked away, his hands tightening into fists, silence stretched. I wanted to believe he was thinking about it. That some part of him was considering, really considering what I was saying. But then he spoke. If you don't stop this, he said quietly, they will make you stop. A chill ran through me. Who? His lips parted like he was about to say something, but then he just shook his head. Enough, Daniel. And with that, he turned and walked inside, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about theology anymore. This was a battle, and the real fight was only just beginning. The first real attack came that night. It started small, barely noticeable at first. A few of us were meeting in Miriam's home, quietly going over scripture, discussing what it meant for us now that we understood the weight of what was coming. There was something electric in the air, a feeling that we were on the edge of something vast, something inevitable. Then the lights flickered. A chill crept through the room, so sudden and unnatural that we all felt it at once. Elijah glanced at me. Did you feel that? I nodded, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Then the front door slammed open. Miriam gasped. David jumped to his feet. The door hadn't just creaked open, it had been thrown open, the hinges rattling against the frame, but no one was there. For a long moment, none of us moved. The wind outside howled, whipping through the house like an unseen force was circling us. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, distant like voices carried on the wind, but they weren't natural. They weren't human. Miriam clutched the cross around her neck. Do you hear that? I swallowed hard. Yes, David's eyes darted toward the open door. Someone's playing tricks on us. Elijah shook his head. No, this isn't, he stopped himself, his jaw tightening. But I knew what he was going to say. This wasn't from men. This was from something else. I took a step forward, my pulse pounding. The whispers curled around the edges of my thoughts, slithering into my mind like a cold mist. They weren't words, not exactly, more like fragments of something ancient, something hungry. A weight pressed against my chest, tightening with each breath. They were watching, whatever they were, and they wanted me to know it. I forced my feet to move. Slowly I approached the door, every nerve in my body screaming that I shouldn't. But I had to, because this wasn't just intimidation. This was a warning. As I reached the threshold, I whispered the name of Jesus under my breath. The moment I did, the whispers stopped, gone, like they had never been there. The weight lifted. The air inside the house warmed again. I exhaled, stepping back. Elijah was watching me closely. What was that? I met his gaze. They know what we're doing. Miriam shuddered. Who? I clenched my jaw. The ones who don't want us to wake up. David ran a hand down his face. You mean the church leaders? I hesitated. No, I said finally, not just them, because I knew this went beyond men. This was spiritual, and it was only going to get worse. The next day, the attacks escalated. I woke to find my phone flooded with messages, not from those in our group, but from strangers. Numbers I didn't recognize. Some were warnings. Stop before it's too late. You don't know what you're messing with. Some were worse. We're watching. This won't end well for you. My hands trembled as I scrolled through them. My breath came faster. Then the last message froze me in place. You should have listened to your father. A cold sweat broke out over my skin. This wasn't just paranoia. They knew. I tried calling my father, no answer. I tried again, straight to voicemail. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door. By the time I reached my parents' house, my stomach was in knots. The driveway was empty. The curtains were drawn. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Dad, nothing. I reached for the handle, unlocked. I pushed inside, my pulse hammering. Dad? The house was silent, too silent. Then a sound, a chair scraping against the floor. I turned sharply toward the kitchen, and there he was, sitting at the table, staring at nothing. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. Dad, I stepped forward. Are you okay? He didn't look at me. For a long moment he just sat there, his breath shallow. Then finally he spoke. You need to stop this, Daniel. I swallowed hard. Dad, what happened? He finally looked up. And what I saw in his eyes chilled me to the bone. Fear, not the kind of fear I had seen before, not the fear of a father worried for his son. This was something else, something deeper, something real. He swallowed. They came to me last night. My blood turned to ice. Who? His fingers curled into fists on the table. I don't know. I didn't see them, but I heard them in my house, in my room. They spoke my name, Daniel. His voice cracked. They told me to stop you, that if I didn't, I would regret it. A shiver ran through me. He exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. This isn't just about you anymore. They're coming after me, after your mother, after all of us. I clenched my jaw, my pulse roaring in my ears. This was real, more real than I had even imagined. And now it wasn't just my fight. They were making it his too. I stepped closer, gripping his shoulder. Dad, listen to me. They're trying to scare you, that's all they can do. His eyes snapped to mine. What if that's not all they can do? I held his gaze. Then we stand. He let out a hollow laugh. Stand against what, Daniel? Do you even know? I swallowed. I didn't, not really, but I knew one thing. If they were this desperate to silence us, it meant we were on the edge of something they didn't want uncovered. And I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The moment I left my father's house, I knew things were about to escalate. I could feel it, a shift in the air, a tightening of the unseen thread pulling everything forward. For days, the warnings had been growing louder, the whispers in the dark, the messages from unknown numbers. The fear in my father's voice. Something was coming. I wasn't the only one who felt it. When I arrived at our next gathering, the room was tense. People sat in uneasy silence, their eyes flickering to the door every few moments as if expecting someone, or something, to burst in at any second. Miriam was the first to speak. Daniel, we need to talk. I nodded, stepping into the center of the room. I know. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. People are scared. We all know something is happening, but we don't know what it means. And after what happened at your father's house, she shook her head. If they're threatening families now, how far is this going to go? David, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, lifted his head. That's what they want, isn't it? His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. They want us to be afraid. They want us to stop before we understand too much. Elijah leaned forward. Then we have to ask ourselves, why? Why are they so desperate to keep us from uncovering the truth? What are we getting close to? I took a deep breath. I don't think it's just the church leaders, not anymore. A heavy silence fell over the room. Miriam frowned. What do you mean? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I think we're dealing with more than just people. Elijah's gaze sharpened. You mean? I nodded. The things we've been experiencing, the voices, the warnings, the way people know things before we even tell them. I don't think that's human. I think something else is working against us. David exhaled. Spiritual warfare. The word settled over us like a weight. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then from the back of the room, a new voice broke the silence. Then we fight back. I turned sharply. A man I didn't recognize stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression calm but unwavering. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, with weathered skin and the kind of eyes that had seen more than most could bear. Miriam stiffened. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward. "Someone who's been watching, someone who's been waiting." A shiver ran through me. "Waiting for what?" I asked, his gaze locked onto mine. "For you." The room tensed. I swallowed hard. "How do you know about us?" He tilted his head. "Because I've seen this before. What's happening to you, it's not the first time and it won't be the last." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, glancing at the faces around the room. "You think you're just now uncovering something new, that you're the first ones to see what's been hidden?" He shook his head. "You're not. There were others before you, groups who saw the same things, asked the same questions." "And do you know what happened to them?" No one answered. His expression darkened. They were silenced. A chill ran through the room. Miriam folded her arms. "Then how do you know about them?" "Because I was part of one." A stunned silence. Elijah's jaw tightened. "What happened to them?" The man hesitated, his eyes shadowed with something heavy. Then finally he spoke. "They disappeared." A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the room. "Not all at once," he continued. "First it was little things, warnings, threats, families turning against them. Then one by one they vanished. Some were forced into silence, their lives ruined by accusations and lies. Some simply weren't seen again." David swallowed hard. "And you?" The man's gaze flickered. "I ran." The weight of his words settled over us like a storm. For the first time, true fear crept into my bones. This was bigger than I had thought, bigger than all of us. I squared my shoulders. "So what do we do?" The man studied me for a long moment. Then he gave the smallest of smiles. "We do what they fear most." I furrowed my brow. "And what's that?" He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "We remember." My breath caught. The room was utterly silent, every ear hanging onto his words. He straightened. "The reason they're trying to stop you isn't because you're wrong. It's because you're right. Because if you pull the right thread, the whole lie unravels. The world only works the way it does because people have forgotten who they are. If they remembered, if they knew, everything would change." I felt it then. Something inside me clicked into place. This was it. This was the truth buried beneath everything else. It wasn't just about prophecy. It wasn't just about 2030. It was about identity, about waking up to who we were always meant to be, and that's why they were afraid. Because a people who remember cannot be controlled. I turned back to the group, the fire in my chest burning brighter than ever. "We're not stopping," I said. Miriam nodded, determination settling in her features. "No, we're not." Elijah's voice was steady. "Then it's time to prepare." David exhaled. "For what?" I looked at each of them, the weight of the moment pressing into my bones. "For the next attack." Because I knew now they weren't going to let us keep going without a fight, and whatever came next, it would be the hardest battle yet. The attack came 3 nights later. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was calculated, precise. We had just finished another meeting, one that felt different, charged, like something was shifting, like we had pushed past a barrier we weren't meant to cross. The man, the one who had warned us, who had been part of a group before, had stayed silent most of the night, watching, listening. When we finished, he pulled me aside. "They'll move soon," he said. I had nodded, but I didn't expect it to be that night. I was driving home when I noticed the car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then, when I switched lanes, it switched too. When I took an unexpected turn, it followed. A cold wave of realization settled over me. This wasn't random, this was them. I gripped the wheel, my breath steady, my mind racing. What do I do? Then my headlights caught something up ahead. A roadblock, not from police. 2 black cars, parked diagonally across the road, their engines still running. They had been waiting for me. 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. Do I turn around? Do I run? Do I fight? Then a second realization struck me. They weren't trying to scare me anymore. This was the next step. And I had no doubt, if they got me out of this car, I wouldn't be seen again. Adrenaline kicked in. I slammed the gas. The car behind me wasn't expecting it. I cut sharp to the right, tires screeching, weaving through an alley barely wide enough to fit. I clipped the side of a dumpster, metal scraping against metal, but I didn't stop. My heart pounded. My hands were shaking. Then my phone rang. I hit speaker. "Hello?" Elijah's voice came through, rushed, urgent. "Where are you?" "They're following me." Silence. Then, "Get to the church." I almost laughed. "You think they won't find me there?" "You don't get it, Daniel," he snapped. "Just trust me. Get to the church." I didn't have time to argue. I cut down another street, the black car still tailing me but losing ground. If I could just keep moving, if I could just make it. Then headlights flashed in front of me. Another car. They had boxed me in. No, I yanked the wheel to the side, barely missing the curb as I shot down a side street. My mind raced. I need a plan. Then I saw it. The church. I wasn't far. I pushed the gas harder. The engine roared, the tires gripping the road as I sped forward. The cars behind me were gaining again, but it didn't matter. I could see the church doors, the massive wooden entrance standing firm against the night. I flew into the parking lot, skidding to a stop just as the doors swung open. Figures stood in the doorway. Elijah, Miriam, David, and others. People I hadn't seen before, people I didn't know, and they were waiting for me. I threw the door open, running toward them. The sound of approaching tires screeched behind me, but I didn't look back. Then, as I reached the church steps, the engines cut off. I stopped, panting, turning around. The black cars had come to a halt at the edge of the lot, but no one got out. They just sat there, watching, waiting. I turned to Elijah. "What is this?" he exhaled. "They won't come in." I frowned. "What?" He nodded toward the massive wooden doors behind him. "They can't." I looked back at the cars, my chest still heaving. "Why not?" A pause. Then the man, the one who had warned us, stepped forward. "Because they don't hold power here." I stared at him. "What are you saying?" He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "I told you this wasn't just about men. You understand that now, don't you?" I swallowed hard. Then I looked back at the cars, and in that moment I felt it. The weight in the air, the unseen battle pressing against the night. This wasn't about power. This wasn't about control. This was about authority. They couldn't take what they didn't own, and this place, this ground, belonged to God. I turned back to the others, my mind still racing. "What do we do now?" Elijah stepped beside me, his voice steady. "Now, Daniel," he looked at the cars one last time, "now we get ready. Because this wasn't the end, this was just the beginning. We didn't sleep that night." The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in the air, pressing against us in a way that none of us could shake. We gathered in the church, the sanctuary dimly lit by flickering candles. The doors were locked, the windows shut. But none of us believed that would stop them if they truly wanted to come in, and yet they hadn't. That was what haunted me the most. They could have taken me in the streets. They could have forced their way into my father's house. They could have done any number of things, but they didn't. Instead, they followed, they watched, they waited. Why? I sat on one of the pews, my hands still trembling, my mind trying to piece it all together. Across from me, Elijah and Miriam whispered in hushed voices, their expressions tight. David was pacing, rubbing his hands together. Then the man, the one who had warned us before, spoke. "They can't touch you, not yet." We all turned. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" he exhaled, his eyes dark and knowing. "They need you to make the first move. They need you to break first." Silence settled over us. Miriam furrowed her brows. "Why?" The man took a slow step forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Because everything depends on consent, on choice. You have to accept the lie for them to have power over you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Elijah's voice was cautious. "So if we refuse to stop, if we keep pushing forward, they'll just leave us alone." The man's expression darkened. No, my stomach twisted. He met my gaze. They'll try to break you in other ways: fear, isolation, doubt. They will make the world turn against you. They will strip you of everything until you have nowhere left to stand. And when you finally beg for a way out, he exhaled sharply, that's when they'll offer you one. The room was silent. The firelight flickered against the stone walls. David ran a hand down his face. So what do we do? I already knew the answer. I took a breath, steadying my hands. We don't break. A slow nod from the man. Then you need to be ready for what comes next. Elijah's jaw clenched. And what's next? The man hesitated. Then he turned toward the altar, his gaze fixed on the massive wooden cross that hung above it. The last temptation, he said. The final test before the war begins. Something in my chest tightened. Miriam shifted uncomfortably. What does that mean? He exhaled. It means they're going to make Daniel an offer. All eyes turned to me. I stiffened. An offer, the man nodded. And if you take it, everything we've done will have been for nothing. A heavy silence fell over the room. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. I felt it in my bones. Something was coming, something final, and I had to be ready. The offer came 2 nights later. I had been waiting for it. Ever since the man's warning in the church, I knew it was only a matter of time. But when it finally happened, it wasn't in the way I expected. It wasn't a stranger in the dark. It wasn't a shadowy figure at my door. It was my father. I had just returned home when I found him sitting at my kitchen table, his back stiff, his hands folded neatly in front of him. There was no food, no coffee, just a single envelope placed carefully at the center of the table. I stopped in the doorway, my throat tightened. Dad. He looked up at me, his face unreadable. You need to stop this, Daniel, I swallowed. We've had this conversation. No, his voice was eerily calm, not like this. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears. He gestured to the envelope. Open it. I didn't move. What is it? A way out. The air between us stretched tight. I walked forward slowly, cautiously. My hands hovered over the envelope before finally picking it up. I pulled the flap open and slid out a single sheet of paper. I barely processed the words at first. Then my stomach dropped. It was a contract, a legal agreement, a waiver. If I signed it, I was agreeing to step away from everything. No more meetings, no more warnings, no more spreading what I had seen. In exchange, I would be given a clean slate. A new job, a fresh start, connections in places that could make all of this disappear. It was a bribe. But what shook me the most, what sent a crack through my resolve, was the number at the bottom. A bank transfer, an amount so large I had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't seeing things. It was more than I had ever made in my entire life. More than enough to run, to disappear, to leave all of this behind. I forced myself to look up. Where did this come from? My father's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter. I set the paper down, my fingers curling into fists. You expect me to believe you just found this? That someone who, the church, the people following me, just handed you a check and said, get him to sign this and we'll leave him alone? He didn't answer. His silence told me everything. A lump rose in my throat. How long have they been talking to you? He exhaled, rubbing his face. Daniel, how long, Dad? A pause. Then finally, since the beginning. My stomach turned. I took a step back, shaking my head. You knew. All this time, you knew they were watching me, following me, threatening the people around me, and you said nothing. His face twisted with something between frustration and pain. Do you think this is what I wanted? He snapped. Do you think I want to be in this position, knowing my own son is being hunted by people I can't even name? His voice cracked. They told me they could make it all go away, Daniel. They told me this was the only way to keep you safe. A silence fell over us. I clenched my jaw, my hands shaking at my sides. And you believed them. His shoulders slumped. I believe you don't know what you're getting yourself into. I believe if you keep going, they won't ask next time. They won't offer you a way out, they'll just take it. I exhaled slowly. So this is the deal. Yes. I looked back down at the contract. The words blurred together, but I didn't need to read them again. I already knew what they meant. If I signed, this ended. No more fear. No more looking over my shoulder. I could go back to normal. But I also knew if I signed, I was giving up more than just this fight. I was giving up everything Jesus showed me, everything I had been called to do, the truth, the mission, the warning. I thought of the people waiting for me, Miriam, Elijah, David. The ones who had come before, the ones who had already disappeared. I thought of the black cars in the church parking lot, waiting just beyond the line they couldn't cross. I thought of the whispers in the dark, and I knew this wasn't just a deal, it was a test, a temptation. The last one before everything changed. I took a breath, and I tore the paper in half. My father flinched, his face twisted with something raw, something shattered. "Daniel, no," I said, my voice steady, "I won't do it." His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, terror. "You don't understand what you just did." I met his gaze, unwavering. "I think I do." His hands were shaking. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "They won't stop now." "I know." His breath hitched. "Then why?" "Because I already made my choice the moment I woke up in that hospital bed," I said quietly, "and I won't betray the truth for comfort." Tears welled in his eyes. I had never seen him cry before. "Then I can't protect you," he whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You never could." He turned away, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. For the first time I realized he wasn't just afraid for me. He was afraid for himself. Because by refusing the deal, I hadn't just sealed my own fate. I had sealed his too. And I knew they were coming now. For real this time. Not to offer, not to warn, but to end this. And the war was about to begin. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment staring at the torn pieces of the contract, my mind running in circles. The weight of my decision settled deep in my bones, heavier than anything I had ever carried. I had made my choice, and now they would make theirs. The question wasn't if they would come, it was when. A knock at the door shattered the silence. I froze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. But it wasn't casual either. 3 knocks, even, precise. I moved carefully, every muscle in my body tense. My fingers hovered over the lock, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I opened the door. Elijah stood there, his face pale, his expression grim. "You need to come with me, now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my jacket and followed him into the night. We drove in silence, the city lights blurring past. Elijah's grip was tight on the wheel, his knuckles white. I finally spoke. "What happened?" he exhaled sharply. "Miriam's gone." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I sat up straighter. "Gone?" he nodded. "She left her house around midnight. No one's seen her since." A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. "They took her." Elijah's jaw clenched. "We don't know that yet." I shook my head. "Yes, we do." He didn't argue, because we both knew the truth. Miriam wasn't the first, and if we didn't act fast, she wouldn't be the last. The church was different when we arrived. The doors were locked, the windows dark. But the moment Elijah knocked, they opened from the inside. David stood there, his face just as pale, his expression just as grim. He didn't speak, he just stepped aside. Inside, the air was heavy, thick, like something unseen was pressing down on us. There were more people than before, more than I had ever seen in one place. Some were familiar, members of our group, the ones who had been with us since the beginning. But others were new, strangers, people I had never spoken to. Yet I knew why they were here. They had seen it too. They had felt it. The shift, the change, the war moving in. I stepped into the center of the room, my pulse roaring in my ears. They took Miriam. A murmur spread through the room, voices rising in fear, in anger. I raised my hands for silence. I don't know where she is, I don't know if she's okay, but I know one thing, this is their move. Elijah stepped beside me. Then what's ours? I took a slow breath. Then before I could answer, the candles flickered, the temperature dropped, and a voice not human, not earthly, spoke from the shadows. You cannot stop what has already begun. The room froze. Every breath, every heartbeat stopped. I turned slowly. There, in the farthest corner, stood a man. Or at least he looked like a man. He wore a black suit, perfectly pressed. His hair was neatly combed, his posture impossibly still. His face was smooth, unlined, too perfect. But his eyes were empty, like looking into a void. A shudder ran down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady. The figure tilted his head slightly, his expression never changing. "A messenger." Elijah tensed beside me. "A messenger of what?" A slow, eerie smile curled onto the figure's lips. "Of inevitability." A chill spread through the room. David took a step forward, his voice sharp. "Where's Miriam?" The figure blinked. "Gone." The air thickened. The lights flickered again, shadows stretching unnaturally against the walls. My hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" The figure stepped forward. "To offer you something better than suffering," I exhaled shakily. "A deal." The figure nodded. "Your final chance." I felt every eye in the room on me, waiting, watching. "Walk away," the figure said, his voice smooth, even. "Leave this behind and we will give you peace. No more threats. No more fear. You can live your life as if this never happened." I stared at him. "And if I refuse," the smile didn't falter, "then we will show you what true fear is." A beat of silence. Then, without thinking, I stepped forward. "Listen to me," I said, my voice unwavering. "I don't know who you are, I don't know what you are, but I know one thing, you wouldn't be here if you weren't afraid." The smile vanished. I took another step. "You want me to stop because you know I'm right. You know we're waking up. You know we're getting closer to the truth you tried to bury." The figure's expression darkened. "You don't hold power over me," I continued, "and you don't hold power over anyone in this room." Then I said the name. "Jesus." The figure flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but I saw it, and in that moment I knew he wasn't all-powerful. He wasn't unstoppable, he was afraid. I took a deep breath. "So here's my answer, no." The air cracked, the shadows lurched, and the figure, the thing wearing human skin, began to shake. "You will regret this," he whispered. I stared at him. "Maybe, but you already lost." Then, in an instant, he was gone, just like that. The air snapped back, the lights stabilized, and I turned to the group, my chest rising and falling. David's hands were shaking. Elijah's eyes were wide, but no one spoke. Because we all knew what had just happened. This wasn't about men. This wasn't about politics. This was war, and now it had truly begun. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the fear anymore. It wasn't just the waiting. Something shifted. It was in the air, in the way the world moved around us. The way people looked at me, some with awe, some with terror, some with something far worse. The ones who had always ignored me now whispered when I passed. The ones who had once called me friend now avoided my gaze. And the ones who had warned me, they were gone. Not all at once, not publicly. But slowly, one by one, people in our group disappeared. First, it was Miriam, then David, then two others who had stood with us that night in the church. No bodies, no calls, just gone. The pressure built like a storm on the horizon, rumbling, waiting to break. And through it all, I knew they were waiting for me to break first. I didn't. Instead, I prepared. Elijah and I stayed together now. We barely left the church. The doors remained locked at all times, the windows covered, the sanctuary our only refuge. Others stayed with us, those who remained, those who refused to be scared off. But I knew it wouldn't be enough, not anymore. Because this wasn't just about us anymore. It was about what came next. I could feel it like a storm crawling up my spine. The final moment, the last stand. And then, just when I thought I was ready, the vision came. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't even sitting down. I was standing in the church, running my fingers over the worn edges of an old Bible when suddenly everything shifted. One blink. That was all it took. One moment I was standing in the dim glow of candlelight. The next I was somewhere else, a city, not like any I had ever seen before. It stretched endlessly before me, shining, golden, perfect. The streets pulsed with a soft light, not artificial, not harsh, but living. The air itself carried a sound, a melody, a hum that vibrated through my bones. I knew where I was. I was there. I turned, and he was waiting for me, Jesus. Standing in the center of the golden expanse, his robe flowing like liquid light, his eyes burning with something more powerful than anything I had ever seen before. Not sorrow, not pain, fire. I fell to my knees. His voice echoed through the city, filling the air like a storm, like thunder wrapped in peace. "Stand, Daniel," I did, barely. His gaze held mine, and I knew this was it. This was the moment. It is time. The words rang through me, deeper than sound, deeper than thought. The war has begun. I swallowed hard. Then what do? Jesus lifted his hand. A scroll appeared, hovering between us, its edges glowing with something not of this world. "Take it." I reached forward. My fingers brushed against the parchment. The moment I touched it, my mind exploded. Visions, flashes. 2030. The world split in two, nations in chaos, deception reigning. War not just between men but between the unseen and the seen. A choice, a remnant, and then a return. A moment beyond time. A sky split open. A trumpet sound that shook the universe, and a king on a white horse, coming back. I gasped, staggering back as the scroll sealed itself within me, like it had always belonged there, like it had just been waiting for me to remember. I looked at him, my hands shaking. "They will try to stop you," I nodded. "I know. They will take more. I know. They will come for you." I clenched my fists. "Let them." A flicker of something crossed his face, not sadness, not warning, pride. "Then go, Daniel." The light shattered. The vision collapsed, and I was back. Standing in the church, my breath ragged, my hands still trembling from the scroll I could no longer see, but could feel inside me. Elijah rushed forward. "What happened?" I turned to him, my heart pounding, and for the first time I had no doubt, no fear, no hesitation. "They're coming," I said. Elijah nodded. "Then we fight," I exhaled. "No," I said, "we stand," because this was it. The final moment. The war for truth had begun, and I was ready. The war had begun. In the days following the vision, everything escalated. The disappearances continued. The threats became more bold. They no longer lurked in the shadows. They moved openly as if they no longer cared who saw them. Everywhere I went, I could feel their eyes, and yet we did not break. We gathered. We prayed. We prepared. Because the moment Jesus placed that scroll in my hands, I knew there was no going back. The night before everything changed, I stood outside the church staring up at the sky. It was quiet, too quiet. The city behind me felt wrong, like something was holding its breath. Elijah came up beside me. "They're going to make their move soon," I nodded. "I know," he exhaled. "Are you ready?" I turned to him, the fire in my chest burning brighter than the fear. "I was born for this," he smiled. "Then let's make them regret choosing us as their enemy." It happened at midnight, the sound of cars, engines growling like wolves in the night. Then the lights cut out. The church was plunged into darkness. Someone screamed. I turned sharply. Figures were moving outside, surrounding us. I heard Elijah shout, "Everyone inside, now!" We ran. We barricaded the doors, pushing against them as something, someone, slammed against them from the outside. Then the whispers, not voices, something older, something darker. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe. They were trying to break us. I wouldn't let them. I turned to the others, their faces pale but determined. "This is it," I said. Miriam, bruised but unbroken from her return, lifted her chin. Then let's make it count. David pulled out his Bible, flipping through the pages. They don't belong here. This ground belongs to God. I took a deep breath, and I spoke, loud, clear, unshaken. Jesus. The whispers stuttered. I stepped forward, placing my palm against the door. You have no authority here. A wind tore through the room, an unnatural howling force that threatened to rip us apart. The doors rattled, the floorboards groaned, but we stood. The blood of the Lamb is over this house. The air shifted. I felt it the moment their grip slipped, and then the wind stopped, the whispers died, the doors went still. I turned to Elijah. They're gone, he exhaled. For now. Because we both knew this wasn't over, not even close, but it didn't matter because we were still here, we had stood. And we would keep standing until the final moment, until the trumpet sounded, until the king returned, no matter what it cost. The time is short. The remnant is rising. Are you awake, Dunn?